Hello, welcome to The Drum. I'm Julia Baird. Coming up, Victoria goes back into lockdown at midnight as authorities scramble to contain a highly transmissible variant of COVID.
If we make the wrong choice now, if we wait too long, this thing will get away from us.
With borders closed indefinitely, businesses are crying out for workers. But is Australia's skills shortage one of people or imagination? And is there anybody out there? Why are unidentified flying objects suddenly gaining the attention of Pentagon officials and former presidents? We're asking all the big questions tonight on The Drum, and joining me on the panel to answer them, Managing Director of Islamic Superannuation Fund, Crescent Wealth, and Professorial Fellow at the Crawford School of Public Policy, Talal Yassin. Welcome back.
Thank you.
In Canberra, Director at Government Relations firm Barton Deakin, Cheryl Cartwright, joins us for the first time. Good to have you, Cheryl.
Thank you.
In Melbourne, Director of the Murrabburruck Melbourne Institute for Indigenous Development, Inala Cooper, is back. Great to see you, Inala.
Hi, Julia.
And also in Melbourne, GP Dr Priya Alexander, a very busy woman. Always appreciate your time.
Nice to see you, Julia.
Yeah, you too. If you want to join in on Twitter, you just use the hashtag The Drum as usual, and we're also on Facebook. Now, Victoria has been forced into its fourth COVID lockdown after a cluster in the city's north grew by a further 11 cases, bringing the total to 26. The news was delivered this morning with crushing familiarity, but this latest outbreak is showing an alarming trajectory.
We've identified in excess of 10,000 primary and secondary contacts who will need to either quarantine or test and isolate, and that number will continue to grow and change. Our public health experts' primary concern is just how fast this variant is moving, how long it takes between the onset of symptoms in the first and secondary case is averaging just over a day. Now, to put that in some perspective, the usual transmission is about 5 to 6 days.
It's worth remembering that at the start of this month, Melbourne had gone nearly 2.5 months without a case of community transmission. This 7-day lockdown begins at midnight tonight, and the restrictions on households are almost identical to previous ones, with one notable concession.
There is a fifth reason why you can leave your home, and that is to get vaccinated. I can't stress this enough. The only pathway through this pandemic is for people to get vaccinated as soon as they are eligible, and for our state and our nation to have an alternative to quarantine in terms of high risk.
Priya, I am so sorry you're in this position again. We've spoken to you so many times when you've been dealing with this. How was it watching the press conference today?
It was like Groundhog Day. It was slightly triggering. I think for many Victorians, we just kind of heard the words again, and it was just, haven't I heard exactly the same thing? Is this actually happening? There's a lot of sadness, devastation, frustration, anger. It's triggering, I think, is the word. Sadly, we are here again.
Triggering in which sense? Just like it's just the sense of repetition and frustration and impotence about it, I guess?
Well, you know, I could really go on here. I'm going to keep it short. But you know, a multi-system failure on hotel quarantine, on a slow vaccine rollout, on a contact tracing bungle in Victoria where the wrong site was listed. There are failures here at a couple of levels, and it's just exhausting now. And at the end of the day, I've got 2 young kids, and I think, you know, they're missing out on school and all these opportunities again, and we've had a different experience here in Victoria, so that's why it's triggering. Yep,
and we are going to come back to discuss all of those issues in greater depth. But Inala, how's it impacting you and your life?
Well, during the press conference this morning, Julia, I hit redial literally 86 times to get through to the hotline to make an appointment to get the vaccine, now that they've announced people over 40 are eligible. And I'm glad I persisted, because I've got an appointment to get my vaccine on Saturday. But I do feel for businesses in particular. There's no more JobKeeper. I feel for the artists and the arts workers, particularly at the Rising Festival, which has had to be put on hold once again. It's really going to be devastating for Victoria, not to mention many people who will suffer with their mental health.
The Rising Festival just being launched last
Just last night.
Again. Talal, and you have colleagues in Melbourne who've been impacted too.
Yes, indeed. It's very sad, and I feel sorry for the people of Melbourne to go through this again. But it has a real human impact, and some of my team have taken some mental health days off. And those who haven't, they got a different mood, different demeanour. I mean, this brings trauma. I mean, it's uncertainty, and it's hopelessness and helplessness. It's like,
and it's unquantifiable, isn't it? I mean, that's
the helplessness of it.
Look, as we know, this latest lockdown in Victoria throws up many, many issues. Just do stay with us. We're going to get into all of them in just a few minutes' time. For months now, we've been told that Australia's closed borders have led to significant worker shortages. Some businesses, like in hospitality, are being forced to close their doors on weekends or leave unserviced rooms vacant. There are now more than 66,000 job vacancies in rural and regional Australia. And for workers who are willing to up sticks, there's a raft of incentives on offer, from free flights, relocation bonuses and extra leave. To fill the longer-term shortage, the government has expanded its COVID Job Trainer Fund and an apprenticeship wage subsidy program. It's also pledged $100 million to support the development of much-needed digital qualifications. The Drum's Stephanie Bolchi has more.
At this Thai restaurant in Sydney's north, business is picking up.
Yes.
At the beginning of 2021, owner Alex Zhang said he would get people jumping at the opportunity to work, but that's no longer the case.
Waiting 2 weeks or even a month, no one responds.
When COVID restrictions came in, takeaway orders weren't enough to keep on all his staff.
You start to worry about what's going to happen, and I thought, okay, is there any hope?
Although the business has survived the hardest periods, he really needs the extra support.
I asked my relatives, anyone who available who can walk in to come and do my job.
Meantime, across Australia and New Zealand, Australian Venue Co is looking to fill more than 250 jobs. The group leads up to 180 pubs, bars and venues. They sponsored some chefs and used JobKeeper to retain some staff members.
We have seen some people, I think, exit the industry, and we don't obviously have people coming into the country. So we've had to get creative now.
And that's included an internal training program to upskill Aussies.
How do we really engage them and make, working in this industry attractive and then want to, create a career with us?
The hospitality sector has long complained about a shortage in chefs and cooks. And the Restaurant and Catering Association says skilled migration is needed to help run the 48,000 venues in the country. Rachel agrees.
What we'd like to see more of, I think, is recognising that there is a skilled shortage in hospitality and adding that to the visa scheme.
The tech sector also says it needs more skilled workers. Last year, many of this Sydney web and software company's clients put their projects on hold, but now they're ready to go. Formation have 15 roles they need to fill. Pre-COVID, they'd get around 120 applicants for the one job, but now that's dropped to about 5.
I mean, I think it's as short as it's ever been in terms of a talent market in the last 19 years that we've been in business. The reason for that shortage, look, yeah, I think just there's so many roles. We're just not producing enough people locally to fill them.
An RMIT Online and Deloitte Access report shows that during COVID, among the fastest growing occupations were in programming, tech design and data analysis. But those being trained won't necessarily have the skills to fill the extra 156,000 jobs needed by 2025.
Australia's been reliant on mining and the like to prop up the economy for a while, but tech is kind of the future. I think Australia has the opportunity to be a real leader in that space, but yeah, we're currently constrained by the amount of talent we have at our disposal.
The opportunity to be a real leader, but currently constrained, Talal, not the words that we want to hear. Does this resonate with you in your industry?
Yes, indeed. I mean, in our firms and the businesses we run, we're looking for staff, and in some of the most important roles, we do get about five CVs when we'd have hundreds of CVs.
Why do you think that is?
I think, well, first of all, people are uncertain in these difficult times, even with New South Wales that's opened up. Certainly in Victoria, where there's the trauma we were just speaking about, it does really impact people's motivation and drive and hope for the future to better and advance themselves. The second one is, I mean, Australia's always been a country where we've had foreigners come in and work, skilled foreigners in. There were the backpackers and the fruit pickers, but it was much, much more than that. And of course, that's now stopped. And so there is a real situation, not only in rural Australia, and not only for New Zealanders coming in, but across the board. And I think if the government's not going to open up borders till at least mid-2022, it will just get worse.
And reliance on casuals as well as
well, we haven't talked about
workers as
casuals.
well, but no, we'll get to it. But But Cheryl, is this not the perfect opportunity to push up wages? We've had, you know, the very stagnant lack of growth, to attract more workers to these roles.
Well, we are hoping for wages to increase, and this is the perfect opportunity to do that. Demand and supply. If there's a shortage of there's a shortage of workers for jobs, if you're paying more, you'll get more workers. And so the difficulty with that, though, is businesses, and this is more in the rural areas, but businesses that have built their business model on cheaper imported labour will really suffer from that. But we have to look at the possibility of them paying a suitable salary to get the workers from the cities to the bush. The impact from higher wages, of course, then is the rest of us are paying more for our products, and some can afford it and some can't. But if we want higher wages, that's going to be the outcome.
I mean, is there going to be any alternative if we have our borders closed for an ongoing significant period of time, but to do that?
What can you do? If you're not going to open the borders because we're concerned about the COVID coming in and protecting and keeping our people safe, then we have to look at paying more to get our workers to the areas where we need them.
And Nala, where do you see the problem, the fundamental problem as lying, as getting people into areas where we've talked about wages, but what else can we be doing in terms of pathways to those professions or vocations?
Yeah, I think investment in TAFEs and universities is one fundamental starting point. I agree with Cheryl about the need for wage increases. People need a living wage. But if there are shortages in areas like tech that we just saw in the package, or even in health professions, nursing or counselling, where do you think those people get trained? It's at TAFEs and at universities. So proper investment and support for space for innovation and creativity in those learning spaces, properly resourced teaching staff is the fundamental starting point. And also ensuring that teaching staff in secondary schools have the resources to support young people from year 7 to 12, so that then when they get to their senior years of secondary school, they're well prepared for their pathway ahead, whatever that might be.
And Cheryl, along with the actual logistics of how you support people into different pathways at that pivotal moment in the last couple of years of school, or from years 9 and 10 onwards, are there also cultural issues that for a long time it's been said that, you know, universities are a better way to go for everyone, when that's not the case?
Well, that's been a beef of mine since the 70s, where there was such an encouragement for people to go to university, and that's a great thing, but it devalued trades and the technical skills, and therefore we've ended up with shortages. And I know it's a gross generalisation, but there has been an attitude that people want their children to all go to university, and there should be more respect for people with trades and technical skills. That's just as important as a university degree.
OK, well, for more on this, we're joined in Melbourne by Executive Director at Apprenticeship Employment Network Victoria, Gary Workman. Gary, welcome to The Drum.
Good afternoon, Julia.
Now, unemployment rate of 5.5%, and we have employers crying out for employees. How did we get here?
That's a good question. When we look at youth unemployment, it's even higher, sometimes double in many regional areas to the standard unemployment rate. So it's one of those conversations where, you know, we've got high youth unemployment and employers saying we need better skills and more people to have jobs. On the surface, it looks like it's an easy solution, but sometimes, in a lot of cases, it's a little bit more difficult to sort of come up with an easy solution, I guess. We've got a lot of young people who really don't understand the world of work and, you know, probably don't understand that vocational pathways and apprenticeships and traineeships are a great way of building your skills, getting an income as you go through, and then having a really sustainable, rewarding career.
So how do we fix that?
I think we've really got to start back at the secondary school system. For, you know, over the last 15, 20 years, secondary schools have really been designed to have a really strong academic pathway and encourage people through to year 12, which I think is great. But we also need to have other pathways for young people who may not necessarily be really strong academically and even learn differently. You know, some people are passionate about the arts or creative areas, or just learn through doing things differently and trialing things with their hands instead of sitting in front of, you know, videos and textbooks. So, you know, how do we actually get young people involved in looking at the world of work, looking at what they're passionate about, and also giving them an opportunity to really experience work firsthand. Countries that have low unemployment rates and don't talk about skill shortages seem to have a really strong secondary school pathway system.
Right, and we also need to look at the effectiveness of government policy. And you know, one of the things that the government has been really trying to encourage is apprenticeships, but we know that 42% drop out in their first year. So what's going on there? How can we address that?
I think that comes back to where we were just talking. A lot of young people actually aren't aware of what their expectations are when they start work with an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship's a big commitment. Most times we're talking about a 4-year training and workplace environment. We're dealing with many young people and also a lot of small businesses who don't have the skills to support and supervise young people necessarily. So, you know, how do we actually give young people a taste of what that looks like, get them to actually trial multiple experiences and really understand what they're passionate about and what they want to go into, and also provide additional support for a lot of the small businesses out there. So, you know, across the country, we have things called group training organisations that were designed 30 years ago to provide that support for both the young person, mentoring, supervision, and also support for the small business to make sure that the workplace, the experiences that they have, and the types of training that they're doing while they're on the job are suitable for the qualification.
And in your experience, what do you think is the most effective incentive when we're talking about rural and regional areas? Like I know one area was actually advertising the fact that they had a surplus of eligible single men, was encouraging people to come and take up work there. I mean, I don't know how well that worked, but what does draw people to those jobs?
Yeah, look, the government keep falling back to short-term wage subsidies, which at the moment are really attractive. 50% of the wage subsidies for a young person is really stimulated this space. Unfortunately, they're really expensive and in most cases short-term. So, you know, I think it's really a conversation about, well, what are the local job opportunities? What's the skills needs going to look like in various regions over the next 4, 5, 10 years? And then actually start to integrate some of that into the local curriculum at a secondary school level, into the TAFE system, and actually start to, you know, have a stronger connection between training and real life work.
And Priya, given that we're living on the hope that the borders will open at some point, what kind of conversation do we need to be having about our skilled migration program, do you think?
I think we are feeling the effects of the borders being shut in that respect at the moment across multiple industries, like others have already mentioned. But I was quite interested in a study that was done in 2019 by the University of Adelaide by some academics there, who basically labelled, after looking at 180,000 migrants involved in this skilled migration program, and deemed that the program had failed to meet any economic great outcomes and had also crushed personal dreams in the process. And I thought it's not uncommon in the medical profession in particular for me to meet someone who is a very skilled rheumatologist, GP, surgeon of some form, who is not actually in a regional or rural area where they are required, where their skills are very much required, but they're working either in an ED, an emergency department in metropolitan cities, just, trying to get their qualifications to prove that they're worthy to work here, or they're driving an Uber. It's not that uncommon. So I think we're feeling the effects of it. But even when the program was running, were we using those skills as powerfully as we could? Probably not.
And how this is your profession, so how do you address that? Well, obviously adhering to the highest possible standards. How do we rethink that so we can more formally recognise people's qualifications when appropriate?
Was that directed to me?
Yes,
oh, sorry.
Priya, yes.
Sorry. So I think there are a couple of hoops that are in place. They need to be in place to ensure that we have people working safely, particularly in the profession of health. We want to ensure people are safe and qualified to work in this area. But often we are asking people to jump really high bars and hoops, people who are fully qualified, GPs, surgeons in other countries who have done very similar to training to me, to others, are being asked to jump serious hoops. And I think we need to be a little bit more realistic and go, well, we've got regional and rural communities who desperately need a cardiologist or GPs or obstetricians, and people here are not willing to go out there. So how do we make it easier for the people with the skills to get out there? I think we need to have reasonable bars in place.
Strike you as a legitimate question, Gary?
Sorry, Julia?
Oh, sorry, I was saying, does that strike you as a legitimate question about kind of recognising those skills?
It is. We have the same issues in a lot of the traditional trades and licensed trades like plumbing, electrical, carpentry. Even cross-border recognition within Australia is an issue. And then internationally, a lot of people that come here, our standards in some cases are a lot higher. But we make these people start from a very early position back within the training. So, how do we sort of start to look at ways to fast track some of that? With international borders closing and skilled migrants not coming here, there's a whole range of other issues that we've got to really grow our own skill base to be sustainable long term as well.
Yeah, and something we'll continue to follow here on The Drum. Thank you so much, Gary, for your time tonight.
Thanks, Julia.
Gary Workman is the Executive Director at Apprenticeship Employment Network Victoria. And you're watching The Drum. With me on the panel, Managing Director of Crescent Wealth, Talal Yassin. In Canberra, Director at Barton Deakin, Cheryl Cartwright. In Melbourne, Director of the Murrabburruck Melbourne Institute for Indigenous Development, Inala Cooper. And also in Melbourne, GP Dr Priya Alexander. Victoria is once again bearing the brunt of Australia's COVID outbreak. Contact tracers are scrambling to get on top of 10,000 primary and secondary contacts linked to just 26 cases that have so far been detected. And we know that one of those cases is currently in intensive care. Now, the message from authorities couldn't be clearer. Vaccinations are the pathway out of further lockdowns. And it seems we're starting to heed that message. Today, a record 111,000 doses were administered. The national total now stands at close to 4 million. But only 1.7% of Australians have been fully vaccinated. That is less than in countries like Kazakhstan, Mexico and Cambodia. Once again, this outbreak has been linked back to a breach in hotel quarantine. And Victorian authorities have been quick to lay the finger of blame on the federal government.
If we had an alternative to hotel for this particular variant of concern, we would not be here today. If we had the Commonwealth's vaccine program effectively rolled out, we may well not be here today talking about these circuit breaker restrictions that we must impose to keep our community safe.
Priya, before we get to the question of responsibility for this, can you just explain to our viewers the problem with hotel quarantine and what happened in Adelaide with the spread of this virus?
Gladly. So there are a lot of very qualified leading infectious disease experts, public health experts who have repeatedly called for the hotel quarantine system in Australia to be overhauled, to be upgraded, to be rethought. And the reason is that you are putting highly contagious virus, and we're now getting more virulent strains, which is what we're seeing in Melbourne at the moment. We are putting it into small hotel rooms adjacent to each other, often multiple people in a room, and we are relying on often very poor quality ventilation systems. And there are a lot of people calling for the emerging science to be recognised that aerosol transmission of this virus is a factor and it needs to be taken into account. And at the end of the day, the hotel quarantine system is, you know, the federal government keeps saying that Howard Springs in Darwin is the gold standard. And yes, it is. And as far as I'm aware, there have been no breaches there because they're not putting people crammed together in small spaces. They're not relying on ventilation. They've got natural flow of air. People are generally also happier there because they have exposure to sunlight and natural air. But you can't tell us that's the gold standard and not give leadership to the country and say, we all need to be at that standard. We all need to protect the people within quarantine. So don't forget, an individual has caught COVID-19 within a hotel room within South Australia, and we know that people can die from COVID-19 as complications. So we have an obligation to keep the quarantiners, if that's what they're called, safe, but also to stop these leaks which keep occurring. And it's occurring in WA, in New South Wales, South Australia, Victoria. It keeps happening. And so there is a real call here to, and we've had time, we have had plenty of time, rethink it and do it better. Bring Australian citizens home who are stuck abroad. You know, keep the community safe, keep the people in quarantine safe. We can and must do better.
Cheryl, what's your view on this? Because Priya's absolutely right that for many months we've had epidemiologists and infectious disease experts saying on this show that hotel quarantine is flawed, we need open air facilities and we need to invest in them quickly. And we're still having these problems occur. Can the blame be laid on the fact that we haven't actually moved beyond hotel quarantine, which is not fit for purpose?
Yes, well, Priya does have some very, very good points there, and I tend to agree to an extent. But before I speak about that, can I offer my sympathies to the people of Victoria? I don't think anybody else in Australia understands what they're going through. Yep. After the lockdown they went through. I've been to Victoria many times. I have family there. I was planning to go to the footy tomorrow night. I think there's an element of PTSD in Victoria at the moment as well. It was just starting to come out. So, yes, I understand the concerns about hotel quarantine, but we also need to remember there have been thousands and thousands of people have been brought through hotel quarantine successfully. And yes, a couple of cases where it hasn't been managed well, that it's been allowed out. But I understand the government is talking with Victoria and others about establishing another site like Howard Springs to expand the system to bring more people in. But really, when you think about it, we weren't really sure how this was going to go. So I think acting now is fine. But also don't forget how successful the hotel quarantine has been.
But Anala, there was, I'll come back to you in a moment, Priya, but Anala, there was some consternation after the budget because the Victorian government had asked for $200 million to help with an additional facility. That was not provided. The government's saying they're still in conversations. And, you know, today, very much the rhetoric from the Prime Minister, from Greg Hunt, was collaboration, cooperation, we're here to assist. Do you think it's a question of where the blame and where the responsibility lies now? Should the federal government have stepped in earlier with that assistance?
Of course they should have. Yes, they could have stepped in months ago. And when the Prime Minister today extended his condolences to Victoria and acknowledged how difficult it was going to be, he said to the effect of, you know, anything you need, any help we can offer. And I thought, well, yes, we need the gold standard quarantine facility, the site out at Mickleham, which could be developed into a dedicated quarantine facility. And also, we're going to need JobKeeper. Particularly, JobKeeper needs to be returned for the people of Victoria, and it needs to include artists, arts workers, staff who work at universities, and there's many other sectors, I'm sure, that have been left out in the past. And PTSD, I think maybe that's right. It really has been a difficult week leading up to today in anticipation of another lockdown. Like I said earlier, the mental health impacts may be severe for some people. So 100%, everyone knows the federal government have responsibility for vaccinations and quarantine. They've not moved quickly enough. And yeah, like Priya said, if Howard Springs is the gold standard, why isn't it being put into every state and territory? And JobKeeper. We need JobKeeper back in Victoria.
Right. And yet, the National Cabinet agreed in March last year that quarantine arrangements were determined under state and territory health orders, those jurisdictions would manage hotel quarantine. So is it fair now to absolve the states of responsibility, Priya?
I think we need leadership now, and I think to say that the hotel quarantine system has been wonderful thus far, I disagree. I think if we have to put these really strong caps on Australian citizens from all sorts of countries coming back home because we are nervous about the quality of our hotel quarantine system and COVID-19 leaking out of it, it tells you it is not that amazing. And I think it is time for leadership. It is time for someone to say we all need to be at the gold standard. We all need to be awesome at this and protect the community and the people who are working in those facilities, the people who are quarantining in them. It needs to come from the federal government. Leadership.
Oh, yes, Cheryl?
Well, we can talk about leadership, but we can also compare the states without being political. You can question the contact tracing in Victoria when you see how in New South Wales and in Queensland, one Liberal, one Labor, have both managed outbreaks without having to go into major lockdown. So I think we can start blaming people, or we can all start working together. I'm sure the Victorian contact tracers are doing the absolute best that they can. But why is it that Victoria is the one that's always ending up in lockdown that hasn't been managed?
Priya?
I think it's, I think off the bat, and I've said this to so many patients in my rooms, if you remove the Liberal Labor, as a doctor, I just think, who cares, honestly? This is a virus. I couldn't really care less if it's Liberal or Labor, if I'm being completely blunt. But at the end of the day, yes, there have been multi-system failures. There have been issues with contact tracing in Victoria, which we have been reassured has improved. But there are features that we have known for a while that are flawed in our management in this pandemic, and we have not evolved with the recommendations from experts. We can all do better and work together. And I think the political part of it, yes, Victoria's had lockdowns and Gladys in New South Wales hasn't done it, and they have an excellent contact tracing system there. But at the end of the day, this is a virus, and it doesn't care.
Talal.
Thank you. I think that, well, to start off, because there's more vaccination in Kazakhstan than there is here. We know Mr. Cohen, is that comedian, otherwise known as Borat, has moved to Byron Bay.
Sacha Baron Cohen, yes.
Sacha Baron Cohen. He would have a field day with this. Just let him know about this. I'm just asking him politely on national TV, because it is outrageous that we're not vaccinated. Only 1% or 4 million people have got their first shot. Second of all, the quarantine system, and I know nothing about quarantine system, I'm not a doctor, but I know it's not working for a whole host of reasons. The federal government's had, and leaving Labor and Liberal completely out of it, have had a whole year to sort this out. I think we led the world a year ago. We were pretty proud of ourselves. 6 months ago, we were saying that. Now we've slipped right back, and that's because everybody, thought that they were out of it. Certainly the federal government gave us an election budget and thought it was all over, and they were, they took away the subsidy, then they thought we were going to slide through it. I don't think we're anywhere near out of it, because if the world is not out of it, we're not, and we're not doing what we need to do. Quarantine is the critical part, but vaccinations are even more critical. I mean, we had the Crescent Wealth, which is the Islamic Super Fund, we had Eid at Luna Park, Melbourne, which we missed last year, and we had to cancel it. This is for thousands of people, of inclusiveness and diversity, and and Melbourne is the best city in Australia for that, I think. And sadly, we had to call it off today. And I was just hoping that Melbourne would come back.
Yeah.
And we were thinking about postponing, but you can't postpone, you've got to cancel because you have no certainty. And I think I fairly and squarely put that at the feet of the federal government. I think the state premiers have done wonderful jobs, whichever party they're from.
All right, well, let's talk about the vaccines now. I mean, you said earlier in the program, Anala, that 86 times you had to call today to get
I was
through.
persistent. Yes.
Now, look, vaccine numbers in Victoria doubled yesterday. I mean, and obviously that that trajectory looks likely to continue given the number of calls that you had to make and the people who had difficulty getting through, many of whom eventually did.
Yes.
What made you make that call today and not before today?
The only reason I waited till today was because it wasn't my turn until today.
Yeah,
I
right.
had to wait until people over 40 were eligible. So that's why I, as soon as it was announced at 11 o'clock, I had my finger on speed dial repeatedly. But I think the surge, perhaps I was likening it over the last couple of days to like herding a flock of sheep, you know, from the bottom paddock to the top paddock. If you start herding sheep, you know, like this, and they go towards the gate and then they stop at the gate and they won't go through, maybe they sense a threat beyond the gate. What you need to do then is get the dog off the back of the ute and get the dog to come out and start barking. Then there's a real threat to the sheep and they'll move and get into that top paddock. And what we've seen in Victoria is that this week, all the sheepdogs are out barking and everyone's gone, oh gosh, I better get a vaccine.
Yeah, right.
And there has been frustration, not just people my age and younger, or mainly people my age and younger who I've been speaking with about the hesitancy. I understand people may have very valid reasons to be hesitant, whether it's to do with the risks associated with blood clots or otherwise. But there have been many people under the age of 50 extremely frustrated, feeling like the queue is being held up by people who are over 50, hesitating and not getting vaccinated quickly enough.
And just quickly, when is your appointment for then?
Saturday evening at 6 o'clock.
That's quick.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
I'm waiting
Here
for
in
the
Melbourne.
under-20s.
The under-20s, yeah, I'm sure you'll scrape through.
Yeah.
Fake ID in the other direction. Yeah, I'm actually 60. The Priya, I love the analogy that Anala has used of needing the dogs to come in and maybe push the sheep through that gate. Why wasn't there enough fear? Like, there was 111 days of a lockdown. We know this pandemic, we know it's virulent and taking, you know, different strains on. Why did it take this?
I sadly think that we thought we were safe. We had a long period in Australia without any community transmission, and despite seeing images from India recently with people gasping for air and literally dying outside hospitals, I think we've kind of gone, oh, but that won't be us. You know, we're good here. We don't have any community transmission. And we've kind of returned or had returned to a normal way of life. So I have been in the clinic, like many of my GP colleagues, spending a lot of time counselling over 50s who are eligible to get the vaccine. And it is hard. People are reluctant. And sadly, with the immune-mediated clotting disorder with AstraZeneca, which is a very low risk, you know, we're talking 1 in 200,000 potentially is what ATAGI quote. Because it's in the media so heavily and your feed is telling you about this clotting issue and your brain is focusing on it, people have really, it's amplified in their mind the risk. And so we are spending so much time on the ground trying to, you know, re-educate people, battle the misinformation, reassure people. And I like Anala's analogy a lot. I think, you know, now that the threat is there, now that people are going, okay, COVID-19 is back, it's real, you know, our healthcare systems can get flooded like that. We know that young people can die from this illness. Old people are particularly vulnerable, or over 65s. Now people are getting vaccinated. And as a GP, I go, great, our clinic is absolutely booked out. But my goodness, you know, where were people a little while ago, and why weren't we getting people through the door when other countries like the US and UK have Elton John singing songs going, come and get vaccinated? And Singapore has this awesome celebrity. And I'm like, we had a boring 20-second video with doctors who are fairly boring, like I admit this, we're nerds, saying come get vaccinated. We needed more, and it's happening now, which is great, but we needed more off the bat in terms of encouraging people.
So much discussion of Elton John and of Dolly Parton, by the way. They probably have these global, vaccination stars that we haven't had so much here. But I want to talk about another concerning piece of the news to come out of today, which is that a number of aged care facilities in Victoria have still not received one single dose of the COVID vaccine.
Scandalously, aged care facilities don't have a single dose. There's 29 of them, as you mentioned, but there are several hundred in Melbourne that have only received one dose. So the residents of that facility are not fully protected. They were supposed to be vaccinated fully by Easter. There's no shortage of supply. It can only be that the system that the government has put in place is falling down.
The government says the actual number that are yet to receive a single dose is actually 16 and claim the rollout remains under control.
We will have all of those providers done very quickly, and of course, as I've said a number of times, we've prioritised those remaining ones in Victoria, and we should have all of the providers around the country done within the next week or so.
Under control, Cheryl, but we still have whether 16 or 30. How can this be the case when we know that they're the most vulnerable to this, to this virus?
Well, the figure that I have is 96% now have vaccines. So I guess it depends who you believe. But really, when we think about this, it's a little bit like people were, it's as Priya was saying, people were getting a little bit casual because we were safe. And you could go back to the GFC where Kevin Rudd saved us from a global financial crisis by injecting funds into the economy and keeping the economy moving. So people just stepped back and didn't really appreciate what had been done. And I think what's happened here is a level of acceptance and an assumption that we were okay.
But we're talking about the government rollout of a vaccine in aged care homes, where the onus is on the government to protect residents who won't be able to get out and get the vaccine in many cases. So surely it's not a question of community attitudes, but government efficiency.
Yes, and I guess in that sense there was an element early on in the piece where a question about supply, and there was a question of the AstraZeneca question, and there had to be a readjustment. But I'm told that 96% of facilities now have vaccines. So I think we need to start looking forward at and working together to get everybody vaccinated.
All right. There will, of course, be much more to say on this in the coming days, and we'll bring it all to you here on The Drum. Now, I'm hoping that last night many of you found yourselves outside, looking up at the stars, taking in the magic and the mystery of the super blood moon. The next full lunar eclipse won't be visible until November next year, so I hope you managed to get a couple of grainy pictures to tide you over. Not everyone gets good pictures of these things. Mine were terrible, and actually to a lot of people it kind of looks slightly ruddy and not like massively red. But still, it's an amazing phenomenon, right? But over in the US, the thoughts of many are also in the stars, but not so much moons. They're contemplating something all the more otherworldly. Washington's halls of power are awash with chatter about unidentified flying objects, and America's gripped by UFO hysteria, the like of which hasn't been seen in more than 50 years. The Drum's Ruby Cornish explains.
True believers have walked among us for decades.
Did you get anything wrong? Not yet. Keep looking.
Driving up Highway 17 one night, I saw 3 lights.
And there was one here, and they were moving remarkably fast.
It was the middle of the day and we saw something that was just hovering for a long time. It was just like an orb.
As it was coming towards us, it seemed to come down, like get brighter and brighter as it was coming down.
And now it seems their obsession is morphing from a fringe conspiracy into a national security concern. A change in terminology might lend a bit of gravitas to the recently established Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, but make no mistake, the United States is hunting UFOs. The task force's mission is to detect, analyse and catalogue UAPs that potentially pose a threat to US national security. A threat that an increasing number of high-ranking officials, including former CIA directors, believe could be more than theoretical.
There's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are.
The government has already stated for the record that they're real. I'm not telling you that. The United States government is telling you that.
Anything that enters an airspace that's not supposed to be there is a threat.
It's not us. That's one thing we know.
Maybe it has a very simple answer. Maybe it doesn't.
There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the SA. My God.
Video footage captured by the military and verified as authentic by Pentagon officials have reportedly shown aircraft moving in strange and even impossible ways.
These vehicles seem to have unlimited loiter time, which we don't have. Then the acceleration is far beyond anything that we're capable of.
Here's the strange story. Believe it or not.
Flying saucers have long captivated America's imagination. Through the early years of the Cold War, the country was gripped by UFO mania.
In France, like America, the flying saucer mystery makes headlines.
Back then, the real threat was understood to be the hysteria these mysterious sightings were whipping up. Hysteria, it was feared, Soviet forces could manipulate to their own ends.
The Pentagon says this night vision video was taken by Navy personnel and is being investigated.
But this time around, the concerns are on the objects themselves, though most have stopped short of suggesting extraterrestrial visitation.
Whoa, it's getting close.
More will be revealed soon. Next month, a report detailing everything the US government knows about UFOs is due to be made available to the public.
Next month. Available to the public. OK, for more on this, we're joined in Canberra by Associate Professor at the Australian National University's Planetary Science Institute. Charlie Lineweaver joins us again. Welcome back.
Good evening.
Now,
and good
evening to both of you, your friend. Now, we don't normally discuss UFOs on the drum, and I have to be honest, I'm delighted that we are. I'm completely intrigued by what's going on in the US. What do you think's happening?
Well, UFOs are unidentified flying objects, and as the quote from President Barack Obama said, hey, we have records and footage of these things that we don't know what they are. And as a scientist, I would say, well, that's what we do every single day. We see glitches and problems, and this is an object. For example, on Saturday, I was hanging out my laundry, and I was looking around and I saw two birds. They were predator birds, and they were flying beautifully. They're very, very high, much higher than normal birds. And I was watching them, and then I said, whoa, that's unidentified flying objects, but because I don't know what kind of birds they are. But then right next to them, I saw a shiny object. And I said, oh, maybe that's an airplane. But I'm so used to watching airplanes go at a particular speed across the sky, that's not doing that. And then I said, well, maybe it's a satellite. Satellites, they go past you like this. They rotate very periodically. But it wasn't doing that either. So it was an unidentified flying object just this Saturday. And then I said, you know what? It's probably some type of weather balloon. But I didn't go home and check, whether somebody had set up a weather balloon. So unidentified flying objects are everywhere. What the problem is that the public immediately assume that you have an alien inside of them driving them and that it's come from interstellar space. And that's the very unjustified fear, or I guess conclusion, that many people have from watching too many movies.
But we don't know that they're not in there.
I don't know that there's not an elephant underneath this floor either.
No, you don't.
Well, yes, but we have probabilities that we assign to these things. Now,
no, I understand.
Now, let me tell you, for example, we know that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and we know how old other planets in the universe are. We have made gigantic strides in the last 20 years, and we know that there are Earth-like planets all over the universe. And you would think, well, Charlie, then you would think that there would be aliens coming to us. But we haven't seen any. This is known as the Fermi paradox. Where are they? And, well, we haven't, as a scientist, I would say that ask a scientist if these video footage are in any way suggestive of aliens, and I would say that all my colleagues would say, of course not. They're unknown. We don't know what they are, but that's just, we see those every single day.
We're talking about the US president, the CIA. We have the former director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe, saying these are objects that have been seen by Navy, Air Force pilots. Yes, they're not scientists. agreed, but they've been picked up by satellite imagery that frankly engage in actions that are difficult to explain, movements that are hard to replicate, that we don't have the technology for, travelling at speeds that exceed the sound barrier without a sonic boom. And he says we have multiple sensors picking up these things.
Yeah, well, let me tell you a story. In 1983, Stanislav Petrov had a satellite image of an intercontinental ballistic missile with nuclear weapons on it coming to the Soviet Union. And he said, why would the US only attack with one? And so he did not tell his superiors. And then he saw 4 more coming, and he still said, you know, this is a new piece of equipment. Maybe there's something wrong. And in fact, he was right. There was something wrong. This satellite was looking down on a cloud. There were glints from the reflecting off of high clouds into this satellite, and they were interpreting them as intercontinental ballistics coming towards Moscow. So these, but anyway, what I'm trying to say is, you need more data. You can't just observe a blank blob. For example, look at the footage. It is blurry as hell in those footage. And that's like 1950 epic footage. I said, this is crazy. In the last 70 years, cameras have gotten so much better, and still they're showing us blurry images. So
and it looks a little bit Loch Ness Monster, doesn't it? Some of this footage.
Now there might be an explanation for that, and that is every time they get good images, they see what it is and they can identify it. And then when they have bad images and they're far away and then it disappears, well, that shows up and gets put into the category.
The cynicism is
That's not cynicism. That's not cynicism. That's science. That's selection effects.
Yeah. Almost one and the same sometimes. Talal, you've got a question?
Well, I think it's the UFOs right now with this, what's going on is should stand for useless things officially. Because in reality, I mean, you always ask not only what has happened, why now? Why now? And all the science are saying the same thing as Charlie, that it is, we don't have enough evidence. But I think it's the Democrats' version of keep the people entertained. All of a sudden, Barack Obama's coming out, the Biden administration. I know I'm a bit cynical, and I'm really enjoying it, quite frankly.
Whoa. Now, I would not go as far as that.
Why not?
I think because
you're holding up
about
an alien
life
on national TV.
Yeah, that was real.
Because science, for the first time in the last 10 years, for the first time, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and extraterrestrial life has become a legitimate scientific field. I call myself an astrobiologist. So we're trying to figure out how life got started on our Earth because we want to know whether life gets started on these other Earths that we've just found.
Right, and you found things like, I'm just going to bring in our other guest now, but you found things like, you know, water is not unique to Earth, for example, which is a huge discovery. Now, Anala, what do you make of all this? I mean, there have been sightings in Australia as well, especially in the Northern Territory.
Yeah, the Warlpiri people in the Northern Territory have talked for many years about seeing unidentified flying objects in the sky. Indigenous people around the world are uniquely connected to land, water and the skies, and I think it's fascinating what the Warlpiri people report seeing in the desert of Northern Territory. And yeah, look, I'm a believer. There's something out there. There can't just be Earthlings. I think you know, every episode of The X-Files I think I believed in as well. But I think it's interesting and a little bit concerning as well when the narrative, there was a fellow in the package from the US saying that anything in our airspace is a threat. Maybe it's not a threat. Maybe we should drop the fear a little bit because maybe they're friendly.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a suggestion. But do you think, Charlie, that if there are aliens there, if we should be worried about it?
Well, because the Earth is 4.5 billion years old and these other Earth-like planets are on average 2 billion years older, if there is life there and it develops technological intelligence, then it has had 2 billion years on average longer to develop. Now, I'm not quite sure of how we could assess that in terms of military terms, but if you have had 2 billion years longer to develop your weapons, you will, the US Navy pilots are not going to do much against the Klingon warships, particularly if they use a cloaking
device. They would have caught
up
with us by now.
Right, and I meant to cast no aspersions previously when I talked about scientists being cynical. We love scientists on the drum, especially astrobiologists. There just aren't enough of them on the show. We really appreciate your time, and you've got to admit, me, wouldn't it be great to pore over that data now? We're out of time, but I really want to see that report. I'd like to see it for myself, speaking of evidence. That's it for tonight. So much there. Talal Yassin, Cheryl Cartwright, Nala Cooper, Dr. Priya Alexander, thank you all so much. And to our guest, Charlie Lineweaver, hope you have a great night. You can have Ellen tomorrow, and I'll see you again soon.
From the People's Republic of Turkmenistan. I am coming to you from one of our multiple exposure sites with a very clear message. We're back, baby! Hooky, hooky, hooky!
Latte.
For 87 consecutive days, we have suffered through 0 cases with no sign of a lockdown, so we had to take matters into our own hands. We stopped wearing masks. We started shaking hands, but this didn't work. So we did the unthinkable. We imported the virus from Adelaide. We are not proud! Adelaide is a joke city. They are always copying us. First they copy our trams, and now they copy our hotel quarantine breaches. Farmers Union, yuck. We used to be the gold standard at spreading this virus, and now, like a pathetic sourdough starter, we are borrowing culture from South Australia to restore our former glory. Hooky!
Latte.
But now our artisanal pandemic bread has risen and we have returned to a glorious world of panic and restrictions. Only in Turkmenistan are our COVID testing lines long while our vaccination lines non-existent. Tram